All right, welcome back to the Alexander Schmid podcast, episode 70, and another contemplative conversation today with a guest of great honor, Mr. Oscar Ortiz. Welcome, Mr. Oscar Ortiz.
Thank you so much, Alex, for inviting me to your show. It's my pleasure and an honor to be on it.
Well, it's an honor to have you. And just like back in graduate school, I consider you a sort of a preeminent man. Well, I'm glad to see that your preeminence is spreading its influence throughout the world and now into Texas, where you are vice principal at, I believe it's a charter school, right?
That's correct. And I'm a principal of both a school in Dallas and Mesquite. It's for a small classical school, so we do something somewhat similar to what we do at St. John's, where we introduce the students to the great books.
All right. Well, terrible work. You know we hate the great books on this show. And well, before we get serious, I have to ask a question that all of our friends, and I'm sure everybody who's going to be listening to this, it has this question on the tip of their lips, on the edge of their tongue, is, are you at this very moment, Mr. Oscar Ortiz, wearing a bow tie?
Well, if I say yes, I'd be lying. If I say no, I would be disappointing a lot of the listeners, I suspect.
Well, it's a good thing.
I'll just leave it up in the air for let
the Yeah, some questions better left unanswered. Absolutely. And so I'm glad to finally have you on. So you're the only one of our friends at this moment who graduated from our program in St. John's, focuses on the great books and the classics and brings together a very eclectic group of people with certainly a family resemblance, not a proper set. But you're the only one that's gone into administration. And I guess just to start off this concentration, I might ask, because I do know that you have some additional constraints on you, and not constraints in a bad way so much as factors to consider, like your wonderful wife, Natalie, and your last time I checked, 2 children. How many are there now?
Yes, 2 children. two children.
And so I was wondering because we were talking before we got on the phone about education and keeping good teachers, and particularly keeping male teachers, which we both know from the book, Why Men Earn More by, what is his name? Warren Farrell. It's difficult to keep males in the teaching profession, and we were sort of trying to understand why. But because I know you love education so much, and you wanted to lead this conversation with a conversation about Herodotus, in fact, yes. I'm sure we will be getting there, is how is it that you came to choose administration? I know you'd been in the classroom for some time, yes. But what were the factors that led to you becoming a principal, a first man of a school?
Yeah, well, it was a mixture of fortune, I guess accident, and a predisposition of my own character to want to serve others in the capacity of a leader. What drove me to education in the first place was a desire to want to live the intellectual life. So it's what drove me to St. John's. It's what drove me to the University of Dallas, which is a small little liberal arts school, Catholic school here in Irving, Texas. And it's what ultimately decided for me that I should go into the field of education. Once there, I realized that I had a knack for teaching teachers or coaching teachers how to become good or better at their craft. And I think that was noticed by the administration that I was working under. And I pretty quickly, I think it's unusual to see kind of a rapid transition from a teacher to administration. Pretty quickly, I was moved up the ranks, and now I'm the principal, or the term we use is a headmaster. Now I'm the headmaster for 2 schools, and I'm very happy where I am. Hopefully my teachers are happy too, and if they're listening, they could corroborate by nodding that I've been a good headmaster, I hope.
Well, that's something I'm very interested in. There are a couple of things. I want to talk about the distinction between a principal and a headmaster, and the sort of philosophical underpinnings of the distinction between those terms. But also, there's something that from the Steve Jobs movie, Steve Jobs says he does when in a conversation with Steve Wozniak, the creators of Apple. And he says, I don't play any specific instrument. I play the crowd, or not the crowd, but I play the symphony itself. I play each one of the musicians. he coordinates them all in sort of a Zeus or cosmic like fashion. And so I wondered if, as a leader, what a leader is, what you embody there is that you try and bring out of the teachers what the teachers try to bring out of the students, and that
Absolutely,
you.
yes, yes. Yes, no, I absolutely have to agree with you on that. There are several levels of leadership. I think that um, talking about it abstractly, leadership is somewhat of a symbol, and I find myself very much, and going back to your one of your favorite great minds, which is Carl Jung. I always found myself attracted to the idea of the king or of the sun and the rays extending over the land and having some kind of procreative power over things. And that symbol was kind of appealing to me. It's always been appealing to me, not for the reason that I think I thought of myself as lording it over people, but as in bringing some form of life forth from the chaos, if you will. And it's one of those symbols that is kind of difficult to actually try to distill in a
Well,
short conversation. But
yeah, well, that's interesting because it's as if you find all the player. You don't create the instruments nor the
correct.
players, nor do you
Mm-hmm,
necessarily write the music nor
mm-hmm,
choose the songs. But what you do is you teach them all to play together in
mm-hmm.
harmony. So it's as
Yeah,
if what you
mm-hmm.
have to embody, which is very
Correct.
interesting about your robust family that I know you care very deeply
Mm-hmm.
about, is that it
Correct.
seems like, to think in Platonic terms, and I love to think of Plato because we find ourselves here in a dialogue, which I find in agreement with Plato as my natural form or my natural theater of investigation, and I think it's the same with you as well. Um, that it seems the form you have to embody is that of harmony, or
Yes.
the guiding invisible but benevolent hand, and that
Mm-hmm.
it's almost as if you, like an umpire, when you're doing your job correctly as an administrator,
Correct.
are not receiving any praise at all, but are
Mm-hmm.
simply getting a limited amount of complaints.
Yeah, well, to go back to the symbol of the sun, I think what I was trying to draw out from it is that it creates the conditions by which all the other organisms or living forms can thrive. And I think that's what it's, that aspect of caring for my teachers, that aspect of serving and making sure that there aren't any obstacles in their ways to be successful educators, and making sure that they're getting the development that they need to be able to thrive as human beings, so that then they can go ahead and model that to their students. That's really what's so appealing to me and what drew me to the role of leadership. But you're right. I mean, every day, and I'm talking about myself here, I don't recall a day, maybe once or twice in my 33 years, where I actually went out and said I was grateful for the sun. In fact, I've cursed the sun for the heat, uh, or I've cursed the sun. Right, so the sun seems to get much more complaints than gratitude. that, uh, I'm not in any way saying that my teachers are in that way. I think my teachers have actually been very good about uh, caring for me as well. So there is a reciprocity. There's this mutual affection, and they recognize the work that I do for them, and they have not failed in returning some of that love or affection towards me. So I'm in a very good place right now. I'm very happy where I am, and I'm in a good environment with good people. Mm-hmm.
What's interesting about that neuropsychologically is that the higher you are in a dominance hierarchy, and if you're the headmaster, you're pretty high in your particular one. The more your serotonin levels are stable and high, making it so that pleasures feel better and pains
Mm-hmm.
feel less painful. And so the fact that you're feeling good sounds exactly right. It sounds like things are going well. So I
Thank
had
you.
a question about that. To take the metaphor of the sun,
Yes.
and to understand it heliocentrically, as if your teachers were planets that revolved around you, that suggests that,
Mm-hmm.
say, the motive force for the universe came from you, or the guiding principle, or the sort of narrative, the mission
Mm-hmm.
comes from you, to put it in mythical terms. And so, do you think that that's part of your meteoric rise as an administrator, or part of your charisma or your particular gravity, that you have brought a mission as headmaster that's clearer, or has a more organized form, or a more pragmatic essence to it?
Yes, that's an
What is what
Go
is
ahead.
the story you're telling to as
Good,
headmaster?
good. No, that's an excellent question. I think that I would qualify your question just a little bit, and point out that I think what has led to my success, and I think that not just my success, but the success of any leader, is that although they embody a principle, they are not themselves that principle. The moment you try to say eclipse the principle, then I think that's the beginning to the end of good leadership.
Luciferian. You are the son that serves the Father, and the Father being the ideal, you being the embodiment.
Yeah, something like that. So I'm trying to think here. I had something on the tip of my tongue and I just lost it.
I'm sorry,
Go ahead. Yeah, continue.
interrupting like that.
No,
No,
no worries.
I'm just interrupting. So what you were saying is that what you are is that you are the embodiment, and that you don't attempt to eclipse the principle.
That's it. Correct.
Do
Thanks, Alex. So
yes.
there is actually a passage, and we were just talking about Plato, Socrates. I believe it's in the it's either in the Symposium. He's talking about a priestess who's taught him the mysteries, the truth, right? The pursuit of the good. He points out that the role of the teacher, and I think that he very much describes the role of a leader as well, because the teacher is a leader in his or her classroom, is to appeal to the senses of the student, so the student is drawn to the teacher, but then a good teacher will take that and then draw that eros towards the good. So the teacher's kind of a middleman, if you will, right?
Yes.
He symbolizes the good, but is not. That's right, a medium, but he's not the good itself.
And so what then he does, and I think this is essentially what Alan Bloom claims, but I could be wrong here. But I think this is right in representing what you're saying, is that instead of taking credit for the principle which he is embodying as a good educator, the educator then points away from himself at the ideal, so that the young student doesn't just adore the teacher, but adores the principle and pursues it himself. And that would be the great failure of Alcibiades with Socrates, right?
Yes.
That he falls in
Absolutely.
love with Socrates, but not in love with good. And that's his great Anakin-like failure.
But you see the same thing in the Meno. Meno falls in love with Gorgias, and Gorgias is a charismatic leader, is the kind of leader that's bombastic, that will draw his students towards himself. So Gorgias is more of the kind of leader that wants and needs a following, whereas Socrates is the kind of leader that somehow he's an equalizer, right? He is above his own students as the guide, but ultimately the purpose is for all of them in community to pursue that good, to pursue the virtue. So I find that very interesting, the distinction between the two, especially because nowadays that's not the focus of a lot of leadership books that we read today.
No, and I think there's an interesting distinction between someone like a Gorgias and Socrates. That insofar as Socrates embodies the logos, he equalizes all, in that all are subject to the logos and their reasoning. All can be accused of sloppy thinking and speaking, very much legitimately at some level of analysis. But what Gorgias does as a sophist is he uses his capacity for speech, instrumental speech, legalistic, litigious, rationalistic speech, casuistic speech, to use a good word you levied against the Jesuits. And,
I was just going to say the first true Jesuit right there.
Right. But what Gorgias does is he uses this word in a way that we might say that lawyers who come out of postgraduate school with the highest starting salaries, what they use their language for, or what Gorgias does, is for power, acquisition of power, not necessarily to find truth, but to acquire power. And of course, the argument in the Republic then becomes, well, if you acquire the power, don't you get to make the truth? And that is very persuasive but very different from what it is that Socrates seems to be doing, because what Socrates seems to do is to say that regardless of how powerful you are, that doesn't change your relationship to the truth.
Correct. Correct. And I think that's one of the most effective ways of leading, for the reason that, and I remind my teachers of this all the time, and in fact, I remind myself of all the time. And in fact, there's this wonderful, and I know you're familiar with this as a Latin scholar yourself. When a good Roman general would come into the cities in his triumphal robes after a victory, he had someone at his ear always reminding him that he was just a mere mortal. And that's something to keep in mind, and I remind my teachers of. I will fail them. I will not always please them. I will make mistakes. But what keeps the ship, if you will, afloat, what keeps us moving in the right direction, is that ultimately I am not the good itself. I might symbolize it as a temporary leader, but we all strive for it in different forms and different capacities. And it's a good leader who will be able to see that in their teachers and see how it is that they wish to pursue that good, and try to create the conditions where they can do that with greater ease at the school level, as opposed to in a different job or different industry.
And so you're a bit like Moses, and you form a group pursuing a promised land, or the promised land being you all pursuing not a physical place, but the good, or producing the true kindergarten, where cultivation of souls can occur, because they are mimicking, which is one of the greatest successes of humans, that we do better than other primates. We actually mimic each other extraordinarily well.
Yes.
And so if your teachers are embodying virtues, then what is it that your students will have access to imitating? Well,
Absolutely.
also to virtues. And if you're doing the same thing, and I'm not suggesting some sort of trickle down formonomics, but the psychobiology is actually in on this. That if you comport yourself in a certain way, those actions will catch on with those around you. And this seems to be the point that Dante makes in the Inferno and in the Paradiso, that those can be ill actions defined as vicious or sinful depending on tradition, or those can be good actions, upright, just. In fact, Maslow actually just defines them. Righteous, right? Ones that put you in line with your family, your community, and your overall population. And so that you would point everybody like Apollo, the sun god, in the direction of the or orient them towards the good seems like the best thing that you can do. And it makes me also want to ask you, and I hadn't planned to ask you this. What do you do with those who go wayward, with those who seem to lose the vision of the good as a principle? Can you see that happen? Can you see a teacher go dark? A teacher who no longer wishes to do good or has given up? Because you have to keep the reins as a teacher, right? If you don't keep them tight, you lose your whole effect. It's like a musician not holding, or like a violinist not holding their bow correctly. It can go disastrously very fast, or like the captain of a ship, it can capsize immediately. Have you ever had to help somebody steer back in the right direction?
Absolutely, but I would use different language for that reason, because it's very easy. It's very easy to. So how can I put this? So the school has its own parameters. It has what defines it as a school and sets it apart from a church. It sets it apart from a ministry and from other different kinds of fields. So it's those definitions are easily lost sometimes, because as humans we're also impelled by our emotions. So I mean, not only our emotions, but our backgrounds. If there's a religious background, if there's a background, if growing up from poverty, or coming from an affluent background, all of those things will have an influence in the way that I relate to my teachers. So there will be teachers who will disagree with me on, say, for example, philosophic matters. Then those disagreements at a school are okay. because that's the type of institution we are. Now, I don't think that would work at a church, especially a Catholic church, where there are very defined doctrines, and the word heretic is very poignantly used and appropriately used for those who disagree with the doctrine. Whereas at the school, that wouldn't be the case. So where there is disagreement, that's invited and dialogue is encouraged. Now, where I see a teacher go astray, it would be in the practices or procedures or the vision that we have set as the standards for running the school the way that we think, or the way that I, as a leader, think would be the most appropriate. When that does happen, there is a process of correction. And if that doesn't, if the teacher decides that he does not want to abide by it, we call it buy-in. Now that's kind of the buzzword nowadays, is there buy-in from your teachers? Then we invite the teacher to find a school where he or she will be more in line with the vision that he or she possesses at any given moment of time. So yes, I've had to do that. It's not always a fun and pretty event, if you understand what I mean.
I can imagine not. I mean, something about, I think, being a leader, and something that I try and prepare my students who I hope to be leaders at some day. And that's an interesting thing. I hope for my students to become leaders. It's something I wish for them to aspire towards, as I teach them of the Odyssey. Of course, of one of the major mythological characters or set of characters are the roving rocks. And we studied the Odyssey together in graduate school, and parts of it in Greek. And those two creatures are Scylla and Charybdis. And Scylla comes from on high and Charybdis from below. And Scylla will grab 6 men at a time, whereas Charybdis may suck down all the salt sea and your entire boat, though perhaps you could get by Charybdis if you knew the appropriate time to go past it. But that would be a fool's errand. And so as a leader, you have to make real decisions where there's going to be blood left on the table, where somebody's going to be hurt in some way, where both ways of looking at it are bad, but one is worse. And so those seem to be the real decisions, the non-video game decisions.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm glad that you bring up the Odyssey, because Odysseus is, once again, another of those models that I would like to mimic, using your word mimic. And I'm glad you especially point that out, because in that passage, it's perhaps one of the hardest things a leader can choose, which is, I might make the wrong choice and lose the life of a few of my men. There is another passage that I find very interesting as well. It's when Odysseus and his men are stranded on the island where is it the cows of the sun god of Helios?
Thrinakia.
Exactly. And he has to find a way in his cunning to keep the men from eating the cows. And he succeeds until he, as a leader, which is very interesting. Why does he decide to leave his men on their own and go on his own up to the mountain? So that's reading it from the point of view as a leader. You're thinking that's not what a leader should have done. But then again, I mean, it's an eternal question. We don't know why he did it.
Right. He falls asleep then, and he falls asleep right inside of Ithaca, right before his men open the bag of Iolus, which shoots them all the way back to the Ionian Isle.
There are real consequences for bad actions or bad choices. So.
Perhaps suggesting that no matter how good a leader you are, you can't account for the choices of those under you. They're still going to make their own free choices. Yes. Will perhaps lead to their doom. I suppose that's what Zeus thinks. But now I want to ask you, so you mentioned this Plato, you mentioned this Odyssey by this Homer. Great books. Why great books to teach the young, Mr. Ortiz? Why we have so many books these days, and they're laminated and nice, and they have bold print, and they come with CD-ROMs or DVD-ROMs or just URLs at this point, and you can play apps with them, and there are all sorts of people who are educated by these same books with these same bold letters who take these univariate statistics and say that's how the world is. And why these old dusty tomes, these irrelevant, long ago, passed by nonsense books? Why these?
Yeah, I think we call them great books for the reason that unlike other books. And I don't want to disparage contemporary books. I'm sure there are some good books out there. I just haven't read them.
You have other responsibilities.
That's right. But these are the kinds of book that more, I would say, and I hate to use the word efficiently, but there is a degree of efficiency that we need to, as a school, we need to keep our finger on, that most efficiently draw the students to a view of the world that will expand their horizons. So they're not just exposed to the tail end, say, of the Western tradition, which is a very materialistic, very much technologically driven worldview, but they're also exposed to a worldview, which is what we'll be looking at when we go into Herodotus, right? That views the world as good, views the world as being full of truth, and views the world as beautiful and purposeful, and there's an order. So exposing the students to that entire trajectory from the beginning to the end is really to give the students a holistic understanding of human history, of the world, and who they are, which I find lacking in books today that's singularly focus on just the experience of the student and where they're at in their own time. So I actually find contemporary books to do the opposite than what they intend to do. They narrow the experience of his own place and time, and make, in my opinion, I'm going to use this word. I know it's a word that's thrown out a lot today. Make bigots of the students because they cannot relate
and disorient them.
Yes.
Yeah, so that's so interesting to say that a modern piece of literature that fails to give an appropriate historical context, because of course it can't, and one should have been understood to have already acquired that historical context. It's a very interesting way of reading it, because I recently did hear a claim made that one studies history in order to understand oneself, because since we exist not only in space but also in time as humans, to see our progression and our changes over time shows us what is specific to us as a people, say in the West, politically and culturally and religiously and linguistically, but also what is general to all humans, to all structures of humans and all cultures. And so we understand both our kinship with all humans, while also the specific differences that have made us more efficient and successful within certain parameters, say in health, science, technology, war, disease prevention, economically speaking, productionally speaking, in several different spheres, if we consider the West in general, and specifically the US, where you and I both live. And so,
there is a push, and I think it comes and goes. It's not as strong as it used to be, but the fact that it comes and goes makes me suspect that we'll be seeing it rising again here pretty soon, which suggests, well, it doesn't suggest, that's kind of a soft word. It's more of a tyrannical movement, really, that says that students should only focus on those texts that are immediately relevant to them. So how does that translate in practicality, in the practical world? Well, Hispanic children should only read texts with Hispanic protagonists. And that's great. It's great for them to know that there are heroes within their own cultures. But what I like about the Great Books program is that it really stretches that narrowness and suggests to the Hispanic student, and I'm speaking specifically Hispanics because I am one, suggests to the Hispanic student that there are heroes in other cultures as well, not just my culture, not just in among my family or the people that look like me or speak like me, and that not only do heroes exist today, but have existed across time, and they're still possible to be heroes in the future. And I can be one of those. So that's why I think the Great Books program is actually expansive in that sense, and it's diverse, and it's open to appreciating humanity as a whole, as a noble creature, Whereas this push, which is called progressive, which is called liberating and enlightened, does the opposite.
And so are you claiming that if I come from a different culture from the book I'm reading, I could actually stand to learn something from that culture? And that might be called true diversity of thought, because I might recognize not only what is different between them in terms of, say, if I'm reading Homer, religion, language, part of the world, way of life, even way they poop would have been different from how I do it, given we have access to toilets, which is wonderful. But it's interesting that you say that, because what it makes me think of is that these great books, what it does is that they teach that this narrative from the West is not just a narrative of, like, say, a specific person with a specific conscious agenda, but rather more a progression of a specific skill set or set of values that has made people successful in their exploration and securing of that which is theirs throughout the world. It's almost as if, and perhaps I read this due to my work with Mr. Westchance and our trying to unpack the shape and the structure of stories and all mythic narratives, but that it's almost as if the study of the West is the study of the progression of the logos in the world, or the embodiment of the consciousness of man, the specific difference between man and all the animals, that which makes him appropriate to rule, represented by the crown or the halo, the golden mark of divinity or wholeness of perspective that a human can have, that an animal cannot. And so if one can recognize that movement throughout history, could not, say, somebody produce that in the world today? Could not, like you were saying, any young student embody the logos and therefore embody the good, become a hero today? It seems as if the idea of the great books is not to throw the good back into the past and say things used to be good, but they're terrible now. Like some idea that the age of gold was long past when never returned. That was never the narrative, right? The age of gold was always in the past and in the future, whether it be a pagan or a Christian idea. There's Eden in the past, there's heaven or celestial paradise in the future. There's a giant flood in the past for the Greeks, and there's still the White Isle in the future, depending on if it's not Homer. But so
that's Sorry, go ahead.
No, but just that the idea of the great books is that they connect young would-be heroes who are alive today with the heroes of the past. They don't create oppressors. They don't create people with specific small modern political which constrain their view of the world and poison their thinking and speaking, but rather make somebody open to the light of truth, which comes from no particular voice and no particular creed, but speaks through all people.
Yes, absolutely. And perhaps something good, important to point out as well is that this, what we call a tradition, and I think that's a word that scares a lot of people when they hear the word tradition. But what we call this, say, this movement, this progression throughout history, it hasn't always been in agreement with itself. And that's important to point out, because one of the main attacks that we'll get from people who don't understand what we're doing is that we're indoctrinating the students. It's as if we have a set of beliefs that we're making sure that the students just wholly imbibe and not question. No, in fact, if there is a principle, it would be the one that suggests that we ought to question what we're being taught. We ought to question what we're receiving. We ought to make it something new, and as opposed to what our Enlightenment, what our Enlightenment ancestors, right, did, which they threw the baby out with the bathwater. So they totally repudiated it. So again, that's just evidence that even someone as Kant, right, Immanuel Kant, is part of a tradition that repudiates parts of the tradition. There's not complete agreement. It's not a religious creed, as you pointed out. I thought that was good.
Yeah, and I mean, Kant himself, you're reading a Lutheran, you read Catholics like St. Thomas Aquinas and Dante, you read Milton himself, who's a Protestant, you read Homer, who's a pagan, and Aristotle. And it's just an interesting idea about that indoctrination is that you're teaching the absolute wrong people in order to indoctrinate, because Aristotle teaches people the mechanisms by which to disagree in a
Yes.
free society.
Mm-hmm.
He teaches how to deliver logic and how to deliver oratory to crowds of people, and you can access this information freely. It seems as if the only way to indoctrinate now is to fail to listen to others,
Mm-hmm.
and thus you indoctrinate yourself by calcifying your ears and your mind against additional learning. It's as if it is an ultimate Luciferian act in the Danteistic way of totally shutting oneself off in a cavern below the earth, and impotently causing the ice which one is surrounded by, which keep one from the reality around one and the warmth of compassion. It's as if that ice is created from their own tears and they're blowing their own wings. It's as if the great books and the great thinkers who are disagreeing with each other and one-upping each other and coming from different cultures and language and
Yeah.
religious backgrounds
Mm-hmm.
and different economic statuses as
Mm-hmm.
well, and totally different nations and cultures and languages, if I didn't already say that.
Yes.
It's as if what they're teaching you how to do is to both learn from them and
Yes.
disagree from them. They are trying
Mm-hmm.
to, as Dante achieves from Virgil finally at
Yes.
the end of the Purgatorio, is to free your will,
Correct.
like our college St. John said, to make free men from boys by means of books and a balance.
It's great. It's even great to read accounts on how these thinkers themselves disliked other thinkers. So, for example, Milton never mentions Dante. I mean, there's never never at all. I mean, it's just fascinating.
And he lived in Florence.
Precisely.
I think about that all the time. I teach them both,
Yeah.
and it's incredible that Milton just sort of completely passes over Dante, and there's limited scholarship on the relationship between the two of them, which is so
fascinating.
so interesting.
And then you have Hobbes and Descartes. They would have a visceral reaction to each other. They just could not even be in the same room with each other. It's just they had such opposite conclusions to the same question that at the core of their being they couldn't even tolerate each other. So I mean, this is the way it is in what we call the great books, and it's a great example to our students that what we're not asking of them. What we're asking is not automatons. We're asking deep, serious thinking. We're asking them to really look down into the core of their being and ask the question, why am I here? Is there a purpose to life? Can I be heroic? And what I see a lot in contemporary texts, especially texts for children, is that they're not provided that source from which they can draw the idea that they can be heroes as well, except in comic books. But, to be a hero in a comic book, you have to be stung by a bee or bit by some kind of insect. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense.
Well, it's interesting because I see that it seems what you're saying is if we wish to maintain a free society, the best mechanism by which we can do that is to generate free individuals.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And a free individual is one who can question his underlying assumptions and therefore agree or disagree with them and thus maintain them or change them as necessary. And that seems to be what the freedom of speech to talk to those around you enables in the democratic process and the sharing of the logos and shaping community through the shared conversation that we have. And what's interesting about those comics is this is something I teach the students when I teach them how to interpret symbols, is that these two, that they're the most incredible creatures that have ever existed. Not something in a comic book or a video game. That look at the primates, look at the gorillas. They can't do anything that we can do. They can't type a number. They can't speak. They can't enjoy a symphony. They can't produce a symphony. They can't use technology. It's like, no, you are the finest creature to have ever existed in the finest generation of creatures ever to have existed in the wealthiest, most prosperous country ever to have existed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Not some comic book hero is incredible. You're incredible. Yeah. And the second thing about that is that these mutants and these comics and stuff, they represent what our students actually are. These people with incredible potentials, with creative potential to do unique things in the world. It's like, students, don't wait for a radioactive spider to bite you. That's an anomalous idea. Pursue
Yes.
your creativity, your talent, pursue what you are meant for. You have a place in the world, like the ants in a colony. We too are a species. And that's what I think the great books teach you. You have a telos, you have a meaning. And this is
Absolutely.
a great one.
I do want to say real fast that I'm not trying to disparage comic books. I think comic books are great. If I were to choose, and if I had a choice between comic books and a lot of the contemporary books that students are reading today, if great books were not an option, then I would definitely encourage comic books. I think that they do have a place in the imagination of children, and they do function in many ways like great books or fairy tales used to function in the past. I don't think that they have the same effect. I don't think they're as effective. Again, the word effective, as the great books can be in developing not just the soul, but the skills of comprehension and good rational thinking. But I do think they have a place in forming the character or the soul of the child into that pursuit of being heroic. Again, most of them, however, as you pointed out, they do involve some kind of chance happening, some kind of mutation, some kind of, as opposed to a deliberate choice of the will to be better.
Though I do suppose that in some, I mean, I Captain America and Batman are the exception. We like them because of that. But perhaps that's it. There is also recent research in the psychological circles suggesting that creativity is essentially mostly genetic, and so the idea that one is bitten by a radioactive spider does seem true. And anybody that knows anybody who's an excellent musician, even though it requires lots of practice, or anybody who's a tremendous artist, visually speaking,
Yes,
knows
so I
something
definitely endorse
about this.
Spider-Man, no doubt about it, hands down.
Yeah. So my last question before we go, and hopefully we have many of these conversations, and
Yes,
I've yet to even, I'm so rude, I haven't told anybody that you are intending to start your own podcast, which I can't wait to hear what the
yes.
title will be, what the focus, and hopefully
Mhm.
at some point I can be on it. I just had the chance to be on Wes's podcast, which
Wonderful.
he formally said that he received the motivation to do that from me, and so that was a really cool moment for me, and so that'd be really cool to be able to be on your podcast as
Mhm.
well. But so before when we were setting up this conversation, we were wheeling and dealing, and what are we going to talk about, and when you wanted to talk about Herodotus, the father of
Correct.
history, the father of lies, and so what was it about Herodotus? And we can actually get into a passage of his in one of these next conversations. But why Herodotus? Is it because he's the arch figure of tradition, the rock upon which Western history is founded, or what was it that drew you to him, that you wanted to speak about him publicly like
Yes, so it
this?
was actually something a little more humble than kind of a lofty ideal. It was a quote. So, as someone who, as a foreigner who's actually come into this country and is now living here, got married with an American woman, very happy, have American children. Um, I'm so fascinated by colloquialisms, right? From these pithy phrases that Americans use to express a lot, and I'm fascinated by them because they don't come easy to me. I really have to work at trying to trying to pass as a authentic American person, or to sound
Huh.
like one at least. So one of these was as rich as Croesus, and I came across it. I can't recall exactly where, but I thought to myself, having gone to a classical school, having been classically educated, I thought to myself, oh, wow, I don't hear that said often anymore. And if I did say it, if I were to use it in a conversation, say, I wonder if people would just stare at me without any idea as to what I meant by it or what the background story is. And I wondered how many people had actually read Herodotus or knew that it actually comes from a story that Herodotus tells. And that drew me. Having read the story a long time ago and having read it at St. John's as well, that drew me back to Herodotus, and it's been a text that I've been reading over the past few months, this last year. So that's why I wanted to address and talk about Herodotus, with an emphasis, of course, on the idea of wisdom and how it's no longer what we pursue at schools, which is something that's really close to my heart. Um, so yeah, I think
So
I've made sense.
perhaps
Hopefully, I made sense.
of course it generally makes more sense when you hear it as an audience member than it does when you speak it. I've found when I listen to myself. But so I suppose the great books for you then are like the Riches of Croesus, or an expression that once conveyed such meaning, that because there's so much meaning, so much orienting power, so much such a way to shine the meaning of one's life onto one's existence, that we should not let the great books and the education they have to provide us go the way of expressions like the Riches of Croesus,
Yes.
but
Go ahead.
make them just as not common but robust
Yes.
as support, comment or proper nouns,
Mm-hmm. Well,
perhaps.
yeah, if you think of these phrases, these colloquialisms, sayings, as having a life source, um, I wonder how many of these are just going extinct, if you will, for the reason that we've no longer have a connection to these texts or these books anymore, so that even the word itself is kind of a dead body just coming out of your mouth. People just looking at it as, where did that come
That's
from?
interesting.
Yes.
The greatest mythological traditions represent the decay of culture, as having sort of an old decayed king, or the body or husk of the dead king that people are still living on. And so that would be what language without thought would become more slogans, which actually comes from something Scottish, which means something like battle cry of the dead, Jordan Peterson teaches us. And so the idea the idea that well so and also we discard useless things all the time, music, tools that no longer have value, like how many
Yes.
VCRs do we have now, or record players, even though they're vintage. And so much of that happens with expressions and language as well. But what we may lose with these great books is not only sharpening tools, but larger structures of
Yes.
higher value that offer us a stability of culture and of insight into each other, which we may only recognize the absence of after they are gone.
Absolutely, yes, and there is hope. I tend to be an optimistic person. There is hope. There is still something that links us to those books, links us to those ideas, because we're still using these sayings. Not all of them, but we're using some of them. In fact, I did a quick search to see where else is this as rich as Croesus being used, and I found out that there was a rapper who, in one of his lyrics, included it, and it made me wonder again. Okay, so this is a great way to express a lot of meaning, deep meaning, in such a short saying. How much of that is actually being conveyed in this in the lyrics? And it does. I think that as long as we are continually using these words, or these sayings, we are somehow keeping that alive. But I don't know. There might be a time. What do you call it? A time associated to it, an expiration date associated to it, and it would be a pity if we did lose a saying that is as significant as rich as Croesus. So I would love to explore that with you, Alex, if you have the time.
Absolutely. And it sounds like you're already answering yes to a question I intend to ask right now. Can we have you back soon, Mr. Oscar Ortiz?
Absolutely. You can count on it.
Well, you can consider me as rich as Croesus, and all of our listeners as well, if you keep coming on.
Great.
Well, thank you very much for coming by, and I can't wait to hear how your podcast progresses. And I have many. I have a cornucopia of questions remaining
Fantastic.
for you, and I'll be sharing this with all of our friends and everybody else we know, and hopefully they have questions and take some comfort from your voice and your leadership and your guidance, just as your teachers and your students do.
Thank you
and
very
your family
much, Alex.
as well.
I appreciate the time and the invitation, and I look forward to doing this again.
I can't wait. Until next time, thank you.
Have a good evening. Bye-bye.
The podcast you just heard was published with Anchor. Got something you want to say to the creator of this show? Send them a voice message using the Anchor app, free for iOS and Android.